Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of This Is My Story. We are so excited today to have Mike Harland as our guest. Now, I mentioned this morning that Mike is coming as our new Associate Pastor of Worship, and we are thrilled to have Mike with us. Now, Mike may be familiar to some of you. Several years ago, he was the Minister of Music at Broadmoor Baptist Church. But here in the last 15 years, he's been the Director of Lifeway Worship. And so we are thrilled to have Mike and his wife, Teresa, to come to be a part of the Jackson metro area and to be here on staff at First Baptist Church, Jackson. So Mike, tell us a little bit about your story.
Oh, well, I'm a Mississippi guy.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
A friend of ours told you that I talk about Mississippi like most people talk about heaven.
That's right.
That's not quite the truth, but grew up in Corinth. Mom and dad, faithful servants of the Lord. Grew up at Tate Street Baptist Church, which is now Tate Baptist Church. It relocated off Tate Street, and they renamed it, lost the street part. Mom and dad still live there. Grew up in a godly home. Older sister, older brother, a family that did church together, did life together, sports, music. An awesome experience growing up in Corinth.
Yeah. Now, you were a baseball player.
Yes.
And tell us about that.
Well, my brother's bigger than me, and he was much an athlete, and like a lot of little brothers, I had to do something to keep up with him, and so I was just about 2 steps behind him all the time. And he says, because he used to pick on me all the time, that I started picking up things and throwing it at him, and that's how I started playing baseball.
Yeah.
But when I was in high school, I was able to throw the ball enough to get some attention of some schools, and was so blessed out of high school to sign a scholarship to play at Delta State. Yep. And I went to Delta State, played baseball there. My legendary coach, Boo Ferris, a lot of people know that name. He was my coach there.
Yeah.
And yes, I have an imitation of him like every player that ever played for him. But the interesting thing was I was a baseball player on scholarship majoring in music.
Yeah.
And that was a funny thing to do because a music major in college is a really busy person.
Right.
But a baseball player, I mean, in 8 weeks, we would play 60 games.
Sure.
And so how do you do music major and baseball, and let's just say it wasn't always easy to pull off. But,
I bet not.
But I won't take anything in the world for that experience of playing baseball in college.
Sure.
It was a dream come true for me to get to do that.
That's awesome. And tell us how you came to know the Lord.
Well, like I said, I grew up in a Christian family, but and when I was 6 years old, I actually made a profession of faith, a public profession of faith. I was in that line of kids after a VBS and found my way into the baptistry. And I heard on one of your other interviews of telling the story, I heard someone else that you've already talked to have a testimony something like this.
Right.
Because years later, I realized that I had not followed the Lord in baptism since my conversion experience. I'll get back to that part of the story in just a minute. But when I was 13 years old, I was on a youth choir tour. Our church there at Tate Street had a youth choir that did mission tours and backyard Bible clubs and all of that. And I was on one of those, my very first one of those. And I was already singing and playing guitar and doing some of those things musically. But on that mission tour, I heard the Lord speaking to me a different way. And it was a voice saying, I want you for me. I want your life to count for me. And I went forward in that experience in a youth-led revival. My brother, who, by the way, is not a preacher, not a pastor, but he was preaching that night. Oh, wow. And I heard the Lord clearly say to me that my life was to count for Him. And I went forward and surrendered my life to the Lord. I realized years later that really was my salvation experience, that as a 6-year-old, I had that experience. But really, it was my turn in a line of people just doing that. Right. And that's not to say that the Lord doesn't save 6-year-olds, but in my case, it really wasn't that conversion experience. But that experience as a 13-year-old in a youth revival on a mission tour was the moment I knew for sure that I was going to surrender my life to the Lord and I was going to give my life to Him. My call to ministry really becomes the same commitment, because as I went forward to say that, my understanding of what that would be at that point was a church-related vocation. It was something I knew that I was supposed to do, that I was wired to do. And so I went on to continue to be active in our youth group and our church. I began to lead music in our church. Ministry of Music gave me so many opportunities as a young person to do that. Yeah. Went on to college, and it was serving my first full-time church that I fell under deep conviction that my baptism was out of order. That conversion experience at 13 years old was the real deal, but that I had not been obedient in baptism. And so one Sunday morning at Parkview Baptist Church in Greenville, which is where I was serving at the time, my pastor at that time was Dan Robertson. Yeah. And I had talked to Dan a little bit before the service, so it didn't catch him completely off guard. But I started the hymn of invitation and then responded to it.
So the minister of music
I did.
came down
I did.
off the stage.
It shocked my
That's
wife,
awesome.
Teresa. She's like, are we surrendering to missions right now or what's happening?
Right.
And so, but I went down there and I said, I want to just say once and for all in front of this church that Jesus is the Lord of my life, and I want to be obedient to Him. And I want to be obedient to Him in this area of baptism. And so that night I was baptized, and so that kind of closed the loop on that conversion aspect of my life. But it's been a journey. My life has taken so many turns and twists, and the Lord's been so faithful to us. And as you've already alluded, some of that ministry happened right here in Jackson, Mississippi. It's a very special place for us. But that's part of my story.
Awesome. Well, I know, so from Delta State, you went on to seminary.
I did.
And you served some churches. Of course, we are familiar with you served here at Cross Gates in Brandon,
Yes.
also Broadmoor. Then you went and served churches in Texas.
Did.
And then went to Lifeway.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about what you did at Lifeway.
Well, while I was at Cross Gates, something began to happen in my life. I did not plan for this. It wasn't something I aspired to have happen, but I'd been writing songs along the way in my life, really from the time I had picked up a guitar and started playing and singing. Yeah. I was writing songs, and in those early days, most of them had to do with some girl somewhere. And thankfully, I can't remember any of those songs today. I'm so glad I can't remember.
Names.
Or the girls' names, which is a good thing.
That's right.
There is one song I made up for a girl that's a funny song, and I do still remember that song, and actually have sung it through the years. But anyway, but I started writing songs, and then as my Christian faith began to mature, I began to write songs that were expressing my faith. And most of the time, those songs were songs that were written in a quiet time. Maybe sitting at a piano or playing guitar and just writing a song and expression. Very rarely would I ever sing those songs. I didn't think of myself as a songwriter per se. It was just an expression of my own devotional life. Yeah. Well, an artist came to Brandon, Mississippi and joined my church. His name was Luke Garrett. Some of the folks around here remember Luke. Mm-hmm. Luke passed away tragically just a few years ago, but Luke had come to my church, and one day, I was still getting to know him, he said to me, hey, I hear you write songs. And I said, well, I've written a song or two. Well, play me something you've written. And I played a few songs for Luke, and Luke that day said, I'm going to record that one. And it was one of the songs I'd written, and Luke said, I want to sing that song. And I didn't think he would do it, but it turns out he did. And that song was heard and began to find its way. And then this song over here got written, and a publisher got interested in that song. And then this publisher asked me to write that song. And before long, I found this thing that had just evolved where I was writing songs and people were wanting to sing them. And I was always amazed at that. I started writing with Luke. We started co-writing songs together. And those songs began to find their way into print. Never dreamed of that in my life. But I'm a minister of music this whole time. But churches are singing songs I've written, which that was a weird experience. So as the Lord moved us to Texas, and that continued to develop, by the time I got to First Baptist Carrollton, Texas, Dr. Jimmy Draper, president of Lifeway at that time, was looking for a new director of the worship area of Lifeway. And one of the criteria they wanted to see, they wanted the seminary degree, and I was blessed to have that from New Orleans Seminary. But they also wanted to see someone that had contributed to church music as a creative. And that was something they were looking for in a leader. And so when they began to look at those people, I was one of those people that was recommended to them for that. Right. I went through about a 5 or 6 month process. It was almost like a Senate confirmation hearing. But Lifeway, I still can't believe this sometimes, but in the summer of 2005, Lifeway asked me to come be the director of the church music department. Yeah. And when I walked into those halls there in Nashville, I passed this row of photographs of portraits of leaders of the church music department, people that I had studied as a seminary student. The first picture was B.B. McKinney, and then Heinz Sims, and then it went on from there. William J. Reynolds, people that are legends, and then Wesley Forbes, and on and on. And there's 7 of those portraits, and the 7th one, I don't know how they did this, but they already had a portrait of me hanging. And I walked into that building and saw B.B. McKinney, and then I saw myself, and I knew then this boy from Mississippi was in over his head. I mean, but for 15 years, the Lord saw fit for me to lead the church music department of the Southern Baptist Convention. Highest privilege of my life, biggest challenge of my life, but also something that I knew, Chip, and I'd hoped, honestly. I loved serving there. It was so meaningful to me. Saw many great miracles because I felt overwhelmed every day I was in that job. Right. And yet the whole time hoping that someday the Lord would give me the chance to stand in front of a church again. And I'd actually said for years that if the Lord ever saw fit to put me back into a local church, I would consider that a promotion. I don't think there's a higher calling than what you and I get to do when we stand in front of a flock of people that are walking with the Lord and growing in their own faith in a mission to reach others with the gospel. There's no higher calling than that. So for 15 years, He had me in the supply chain. Yeah. You know, He had me back at the supply dump. But this part of my life, I can't tell you how excited I am to be back on the front lines of making disciples through the ministry of music. I can't wait. Can't wait.
Well, let's talk about that for a few minutes. So you were Lifeway for 15 years, always kind of hoped and prayed that God would see fit to put you back in church music. Yeah. Why First Jackson? What is it about First Baptist Jackson that makes you...
It's an amazing question. Well, for one thing, I know this church. Yeah. I mean, I've been a student of First Baptist Jackson all of my life. I grew up in Mississippi, and if you're from Mississippi, that means you've lived outside of Jackson, because everything's outside of Jackson in Mississippi. I've been influenced by this church my whole ministry. My first church, Calvary Baptist in Cleveland, when I was at school in Delta State, I came to a young musicians conference at First Baptist Jackson. How about that? And Dot Prey and Larry Black and all those great musicians. And I remember as a 20-year-old thinking and being influenced by the ministry of this church. I remember coming to Carols by Candlelight, several times, just as I lived in this area, knowing about it, always watching it, learning, being challenged by what I saw First Baptist Jackson doing. And through the years of just being aware of this church, and then in recent years actually being in this church. Some of the folks might remember, I guess 4 years ago or so, I actually came down and led worship here for several weeks during an interim time. Right. And then other times I'd come in and led. I'd been a part of the Mississippi Baptist Convention in this building many, many times. I'd led this choir before. I've known of the great Eva Hart all of my life. Her brother was my piano teacher in seminary, and that's all I want to talk about there, on piano, that is. I'm not the piano player that either one of them are, I can tell you that. And so a familiarity, but also an awareness of the opportunity to not only impact a congregation, but the impact a church like this can have on a region, on a state, and certainly on the world. And honestly, Chip, not to patronize you in any way, but I'm very attracted to the ministry I see God doing in your life. I've been listening to you preach. I've been watching your leadership here as a church that I deeply cared about, just as a person that knows it and loves it. So many friends here. And just watching you get started here and how you're already influencing these people and leading this church and connecting with you in that ministry. I really believe worship ministry is first led by the pastor. And the music leader comes in beside that and becomes part of it, but that pastor's got to be right there setting the tone and being a part of it. So all of those things together made this feel right. When the committee reached out to me and I began to think about it, the first question I had to answer was, gosh, could I even do that? Could I even go back into a church at all? Because I would get that question from time to time, just the nature of my responsibility. People would be aware that I could do that, and I'd get those questions. But something happened in late January when you called me that day on the phone, and I remember thinking, wow, could that be what I'm supposed to do? And then I agreed with you that day that we'd pray about it, think about it. I began to talk to Bob and to Chip and Brittany and Courtney and Jim and Brandon, those people on the committee. Did I leave anybody out? I think I hit them all. I think that was all of them.
You're putting the pressure on me now.
Okay, yeah. But anyway.
Let this be on you.
When I began to hear them and see the emotion and the love and the hope they have for this ministry, it just felt right. And we walked this path together. inviting the Lord to stop at any point, and He just didn't. And here we are sitting in this great choir room here at First Baptist Jackson. And the attitude I have about all that is just complete gratitude to the Lord.
Yeah.
I just see this as the Lord's blessing in my life and Teresa's life, and we're thrilled. We can't wait to get here and be part of what God's doing at First Jackson.
Well, we're thrilled for you to be here. I have a question that I think people may be interested to know. So you were a minister of music for several years.
Yep.
Director of Lifeway Worship for 15 years. Now you're coming back into a church setting. Having been at Lifeway for 15 years, what will you do differently, or how do you see, let me phrase it this way, how do you see local church music ministry different than you did when you went to Lifeway?
Wow. Do you have any other questions you'd like to ask? No, I'll try. I'll try to answer that. Well, I'll tell you what, sometimes I joke that I wish I could go back to the first few churches I served and apologize.
I understand that. Yeah.
You did. Because, there was a time in my life when I came in, I would come into a responsibility as a music leader and think the way I did music's the only way it ought to be done. And I would have been much more dogmatic and much more confident in my musical ability to pull something off that would be impressive, and I would be aspiring to do that. Yeah. If my time at Lifeway has taught me anything, it's taught me that there's no one way to do this. And there's no one style of music that is the magic formula. I've come to understand, Chip, that music is a language. It is not the point. It can't be the point. Music by itself cannot do what the gospel compels us to do, which is to make disciples. Music is a powerful tool, and I would argue that it may be one of the most powerful tools God's put in our hands to teach people with and develop people with. Right. I think people learn how to pray when they learn how to sing. Yeah. They learn how to express their faith. They begin to find ways to respond to God in adoration and praise and thanksgiving, which is an important part of a disciple's maturity and growth. And I believe the thing about music in a church is that it is corporate. That yes, worship is private, but it's personal, but it's not always, nor should it always be private. That's right. It's very personal, but it's not private. As a matter of fact, the Bible clearly talks about the aggregation of the worship of God's people. Mm-hmm. I recently had it pointed out to me from Romans chapter 12. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies. And in the original language, that's plural. There's more than one body as a living sacrifice. Sacrifice is singular. That's right. So the singular sacrifice of praise that comes from First Baptist Jackson is made up of a whole lot of bodies. That's right. And a whole lot of other things. And if any one of those is not part of it, then that sacrifice is less than what it ought to be from this church. So when I think about my exposure to all these churches and all these styles of music and all of these things, I aspire to know the language well. It's a language to do something significant with. And I want to learn the dialects of it, which might feel contemporary to some people, but one person's contemporary could be another person's traditional and beyond all of that. I think those labels can be unhelpful when we put them to music because there's not any clear definitions of them. And so it transcends style. Yeah. And it gets down into learning this language and this dialect and approaching it with the larger and spiritual goals in mind. And I say, use it all, be excellent at all of it, and do whatever is the most important and necessary thing to do to engage all of those bodies, plural, into one sacrifice. Yeah. If you do something stylistic that eliminates all of this part of the body, then you've actually made that sacrifice less than what it's supposed to be. So the responsibility of the person leading music at First Baptist Jackson is no less to the person that sits over here and feels that way than it is to the person that sits up here and feels the other way. The responsibility to do both are the same. So I want to aspire to use everything in an excellent way, but to focus not on the styles, but on the gospel. Yeah. And the development of disciples through the ministry of music.
Well, you really kind of answered another question, because I know people, anytime you hire somebody to come in and do music, they're wondering, is it going to be contemporary, is it going to be traditional? But what I hear you say is the style is not what's important.
No.
It's the gospel being on display through the music and people being able to speak in a language that they understand, essentially.
Yeah, another thing I've seen, Pastor, in the last 15 years is I've seen a moving together in the body of Christ.
Sure.
And I'm finding churches, 15 years ago, sitting in my office in Nashville, my phone would ring and it'd be a church leader of a church in Oklahoma or somewhere, and they would be calling and they would say something like, tell us how we can create a contemporary service. How do you do that? What are the things we need to think about? And I could have that conversation with them. And I would get that call fairly often back in 15 years ago. But that's not the call I've gotten in the last year or so. The call I get in the last year or so is from that pastor that says, we've done it that way for 15 years. How do we put it back together? Because here's what mature Christians everywhere are beginning to realize. That we would much rather prefer each other than a style of music.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be tragic if one generation, and pick which one you want to make the example out of, because it could be any. But wouldn't it be tragic for one generation to prefer themselves over every other member of the church and say, if we don't do music our way, then we don't want to be here? And if any generation did that, what a tragedy that would be. But how beautiful it is when the body of Christ begins to prefer each other and not let stylistic divisions characterize the condition of the body, that the body comes together and those many bodies making that one sacrifice together. And see, I'm not even a big fan of what people call blended.
Yeah.
To me, that's making everybody mad at some point.
Right.
Yeah, what a church I think is compelled to do is find their voice, whatever that is, and it could be anything.
Every church is unique. That's
Every
right.
church is
That's
unique.
exactly right.
And every church is growing and developing. And I think the music leader's job is not to impress a style onto a congregation. It's to allow the congregation to express who they are in worship. So what engages this body? What brings this body together in a unified sacrifice of praise that is multi-generational and it goes across ethnic lines and all kinds of divisions that humans put on ourselves. But when I look in the Bible I read says there's no Jew, there's no Greek, there's no male, those divisions that we create, that's not what the body of Christ looks like. So that's what I want to aim for. I want to find that worship expression that is First Baptist Jackson, whatever that is, at our best, honoring a God who deserves the very best from us.
That's awesome. You mentioned the word generations. So let's talk for a minute children's music.
Yes.
Teenagers, college students. It seems in churches today that's not, it doesn't seem to be as big a deal as it used to be. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it is very vital that every person grow in a growing relationship with Christ has to find somewhere along the way, and hopefully the earlier the better, their own way to engage corporately in worship.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most important things for our children to find, think about parents. Here's what parents want. Parents want their children to learn how to walk, and they want them to learn how to eat and feed themselves and use a spoon and a fork, and very soon they're going to want them to learn how to swim, to protect them. There's a lot of things they want them to learn. I want to tell every Christian parent out there that one of the most important things for your young child to learn is a voice to worship God with. That's one of the most important things a young disciple needs to find and needs to find early. That's why I'm a big believer in helping children and students as they're developing all these skills and acquiring all of these habits in their life to find a worship expression that becomes part of a lifelong journey of faith that will serve them their entire lives. I feel like it's a shame that we're at a point in I guess I call this the American Idol mentality of music, where people think that singing is for singers.
Right.
That the only people that ought to sing are the people that can.
Yeah, who can get a chair to turn.
Exactly.
Voice,
make the chair turn.
Yeah.
And that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says singing is not for singers. The singing is for believers. That the command to sing is one of the most common commands in all of Scripture, and it is almost always in the plural. In other words, it doesn't just say you sing, it actually says you all sing.
Yeah.
And I think we're so consumed with this performance mentality that we've got a lot of people in our churches that say, man, if I sang, everybody run for the door. And I want to say, no, they wouldn't.
Yeah.
And I would say, just like if you're at my mom and dad's table, They had 3 children. We're all married. We all got kids. If everybody's there but Mike, that's plenty, but that's not enough. And what I want to say to a church family like First Baptist Jackson is, if everybody's singing but you, it's plenty, but it's not enough.
Wow.
And this voice is not the voice it's supposed to be till every single person in this body of faith is part of it. There is a sound that we all make together that none of us can make by ourselves. And my hope and my desire is to help this church find that voice that takes every one of us to make it sound what God intended it to sound like.
That's awesome.
We need every voice, every
Absolutely.
voice. Matter of fact, when I lead corporate worship, I'm very common, I'll say, I'm sorry, I'm going to go ahead and warn you. In between verses, I'll say, come on, every voice, every voice,
Yeah.
every voice. Because until it's all of us, it's plenty,
Yeah.
but it's not enough until it's all of us. And that's my goal. So when you talk about style, I want to find whatever that is that gets every voice. That's what I'm aiming for. That's what I want to see happen. And that's because in my humble opinion, which I highly regard, until it is every voice,
Yeah.
it's not enough.
That's awesome. We've got 5 minutes left,
Yeah.
but I want to ask you about your family. But before I get there, I want to ask you one question.
Yeah.
You said the music ministers call you all the time. So a minister of music calls you and says, I'm going to this church as the new minister of music. What advice would you give to that minister of music coming to a new church?
God didn't call you to lead music. God called you to lead people. And the ministry begins with names and noses and connection and relational, that you've got to earn the right to be followed. That a church gives you a little bit of leeway at the beginning, that
Right.
whatever that honeymoon period is.
Yeah.
I know you've been here just over a year now, and I'm sure you experienced some of that when you came. That only goes so far. You very quickly need to learn people, get their story, find out what God's doing in their life, how you can encourage, how you can inspire, how you can challenge, how you can help. So the relational equity of that, I can't emphasize enough. If you look in Jesus' ministry, He knew people's names. He said, Zacchaeus, you come down. I'm going to your house today. Jesus didn't say, hey, you short guy up in the tree, get down here, and where do you live? No.
Yeah.
The connection that He had with people, so modeled. I think Paul is an excellent example of this. Read the closing chapter of 2 Timothy. Yeah. And it's a roster of, it says, tell this guy that, and tell this guy that, and tell this guy, and watch out for that guy. And you know what that tells me? It tells me that Paul's ministry wasn't the Paul show. It was a whole group of people around him. You know, I think it's the latter part of the first chapter of 2 Timothy. Greet the household of Onesiphorus or Nicephorus, or however you say that guy's name. Yeah. Because he often refreshed me. He was not ashamed of my chains. Yeah. So the model for ministry for me, and I've seen this. My dad was a grocery store manager, and he led his people in his store this way. You know, those guys that worked for him, those part-time sack guys that came in the store by the dozens, you know. Yeah. He cared about them. He got to know them. He connected with them. And I think that's what I tell anybody starting a ministry is get to know the people. Yeah. You're not there to unpack your bag of tricks and to prove how good you are at anything. That's not what you're there to do. You're there to lead those people, and you got to get to know them really fast and create that relational connection.
Well, I can tell you, you're coming into a situation with lots of incredibly talented people, but even more important, you're coming into a situation with lots of great people.
Yeah.
There are a lot of wonderful people here
I
at this
can't wait.
church, and I mean, it's congratulations to you for God calling you to be a part of these people here, because it's absolutely an honor for me.
You know, the folks at First Jackson should know this. When word began to get out that I'm leaving Lifeway and going to First Jackson, the comment that I'm getting from people from all across the country aren't, oh no, what in the world is he doing? You know, has he lost his mind?
Yeah.
Everybody's saying, oh wow, what a great church, what a great place to be, and we're really excited to be here.
Good. Well, you say we. Now, we're going to have to be kind of quick, and I hate that we're going to have to cut you off here in a minute, but family.
Yeah.
You know, your wife, Teresa, tell us about your family.
She's my secret weapon.
Yeah, I agree, yeah.
She is. I met Teresa at college, Delta State. She was a music major. First time I saw her, I knew I wanted to know her. First time I heard her sing, I knew I wanted to marry her. I mean, that's kind of how that went. And then I heard her play piano, and it was game over at that point. Teresa's a great talent, a great person, pastor's daughter. Beautiful girl. You know, here's part of our story. I don't know if you know this part of our story, but when we lived here in Jackson, Teresa was diagnosed with breast cancer. And right here at Mississippi Baptist Hospital, one day, now 23 years ago, we walked a breast cancer journey out here in Jackson, Mississippi with a lot of the medical people, some of whom are in this church. And that's a big part of our story. God taught us so much about how He's in control of stuff and we're not really, you know. We had to learn that. 3 great kids. My son Lee has his doctorate in musicology. Brilliant. He's a scholar. I'm proud of him, I know, but he's a scholar. I read his dissertation and act like I know what he's talking about. My daughter Elizabeth, she's married, lives in Nashville. Her husband works for the Nashville Predators hockey team. And my son John is not married, but he's got a significant other. He's finished a biblical studies degree and is taking seminary courses, has a ministry call on his life. 2 granddaughters, 1 on the way. We've got a special family, and we're just blessed beyond words.
We're blessed to have your family here, for sure. Thank you. Well, appreciate you viewing this afternoon and being a part of listening to Mike's story and hearing how God has been working in his life and his family's life and bringing them here to First Baptist Jackson. What you've been able to hear in these 30 minutes or so, it's just a snippet of what the committee has been able to hear for hours of meeting with him and just being excited every time we talk to him about not only how God's been at work in his life, but how God has brought this family here and their heart for worship, and particularly seeing worship with the mission of making disciples. It's just incredible to see how God puts things together. And so we're just glad to be able to share a little bit of that with you here this evening. I want you to know that Mike's first day here in the office will be Monday, July the 6th. His first Sunday leading in worship will be July the 12th. And so I hope that you'll make plans to join us and get to know Mike and his family. You will really learn to love them. Thank you so much again for tuning in this afternoon. We hope that you have a great week.